On April 27, 1978, 51 construction workers plunged to their deaths at a power plant cooling tower in Willow Island, West Virginia, making it the single deadliest construction accident in United States history. The Pleasance Power Station rises from a quiet bend in the Ohio River, set against the rolling hills of Pleasance County, West Virginia. At 39 degrees 22 minutes 2 seconds north and 81 degrees 17 minutes 29 seconds west, the plant stands as both a landmark and a lifeline for the rural communities clustered along the riverbanks. The station's cooling towers, visible for miles, mark the edge of Willow Island, a settlement where the river has always shaped daily life, from the flow of barges to the rhythms of local employment. In the late 1970s, the power plant was the economic anchor of the county. It offered steady jobs in a region where work could be hard to find, and family incomes often depended on seasonal labor or distant mines. The arrival of Allegheny Power System's expansion project, with its promise of 2 new 650-megawatt generating units, brought a surge of opportunity. The construction site drew workers from St. Mary's, Belmont, and small towns scattered across the valley, many of them born within sight of the plant's smokestacks. For hundreds of households, paychecks from the station covered groceries, mortgages, and tuition at the local high school. The importance of the plant ran deeper than wages. Tax revenue from the facility supported schools, roads, and emergency services. Local businesses, grocers, hardware stores, diners counted on the steady flow of workers and their families. Community leaders tracked the plant's fortunes as closely as the weather, knowing that a slowdown or shutdown would ripple through every corner of the county. By 1978, more than 60% of area households relied directly or indirectly on the plant's construction and operations for their livelihood. This dependence shaped the workforce that assembled the cooling tower. Contractors hired locally, drawing on a labor pool where fathers, sons, brothers, and cousins often worked side by side. The familiar faces on the morning shift were not just colleagues, they were neighbors, friends, and kin. Union cards listed the power company as the primary source of income, and for many apprentices, a job at the plant was the first step toward supporting a family of their own. The Pleasance Power Station was more than concrete and steel. It was a source of pride for Willow Island and the surrounding towns, a symbol of progress and stability in an uncertain economy. The project's scale and ambition promised a future where the lights would stay on and the community could grow. But it also meant that every risk, every decision on that site carried consequences that would be felt far beyond the plant's gates. The story of the disaster that unfolded here is inseparable from the story of the land and the people who depended on it. A cooling tower of this size could not be built by stacking bricks or pouring concrete in a single continuous wall. Instead, the construction relied on a jump form system, a modular scaffolding method designed to climb the tower as it rose. The process began with a ring of steel frames called strongbacks anchored into the cured concrete of the previous section. Horizontal braces locked these frames together, forming a rigid cage that wrapped around the tower's growing shell. This cage supported both the wooden formwork that shaped each new lift of concrete and the work platforms where crews placed rebar, poured concrete, and operated heavy equipment. The jump form system advanced in a rhythm of lifts. Each lift measured about 4 to 5 feet in height. After workers poured a ring of concrete, the formwork stayed in place until the material had cured enough to support its own weight and the next round of construction. Only then would the crew unbolt the strongbacks, jack the entire scaffold up to the next level, and repeat the cycle. The process allowed for rapid vertical progress, with the scaffold and platforms always moving upward as the tower grew. Anchorage was critical. The weight of the formwork, the wet concrete, and the workers themselves, all of it pressed down on bolts embedded in the previous lift. These anchor bolts, threaded through galvanized sleeves and tightened against steel plates, were engineered to hold thousands of pounds. Their placement and tension had to be exact, since any weakness or misalignment would transfer stress unevenly through the shell. The system's efficiency depended on timing. Crews aimed to complete a lift every day or two, but the concrete's curing time set the real pace. In theory, no load would be placed on a new lift until it reached a safe compressive strength. In practice, pressure to meet construction deadlines sometimes pushed the schedule ahead of the concrete's readiness. Every shortcut, reducing anchor sleeve length, shifting bolt patterns, or loading the formwork early, introduced new risks, often invisible until the structure was under full load. The jump form method offered speed and economy, but it demanded discipline. Success relied on strict adherence to engineering drawings, careful monitoring of curing, and methodical inspection of every anchor and brace. At Willow Island, these safeguards would become the difference between progress and tragedy. The mechanics of the system and the decisions made at each stage set the stage for the disaster that followed. A single cooling tower rising to 430 feet was an audacious goal for a small West Virginia community. The blueprint called for a concrete shell as tall as a 40-story building, one of the largest hyperbolic towers in the country at the time. The plan was to reach that height in just 28 lifts, each a ring of concrete poured and cured before the next could begin. By late April 1978, the crew had brought the structure to its 28th lift. The tower already loomed 166 feet above the ground, its curved walls narrowing as they climbed. Each day's work advanced the formwork upward, leaving behind a continuous ribbon of fresh concrete that traced the crew's progress skyward. The scale of the project was hard to grasp from the ground. The jump form scaffolding, a lattice of steel and wood, clung to the tower's rim like a crown. On the platforms, dozens of workers moved in rhythm, tying rebar, aligning forms, and guiding concrete hoses. The work demanded precision and trust. Every bolt, every anchor, every calculation mattered. The ambition behind the tower was more than just height. It was speed. Each lift was scheduled to take a day or two with the hope of topping out the shell before summer's heat set in. Schedules were tight, and delays meant lost bonuses and mounting costs. The pressure to keep climbing was always present, felt in foremen's briefings and whispered among laborers during lunch breaks. By the morning of April 27th, the crew stood on the edge of a milestone. With lift 28 nearly complete, only a handful of cycles remained before the tower would reach its full 430-foot design. The sense of accomplishment was real, but so was the urgency. Management tracked every pore, every hour shaved from the timeline. The jump form's promise of rapid progress had become both a point of pride and a source of quiet anxiety. The tower's unfinished crown, visible from miles away, was a daily reminder of what remained to be done and of the risks that came with pushing to finish on time. This drive for progress shaped the choices made on the scaffold that day. The leap from one lift to the next was more than a technical maneuver. It was a wager on the concrete's strength, the weather's cooperation, and the workers' skill. Each successful lift brought the tower closer to its intended height, but also increased the load on every anchor and every decision. The ambition that fueled the project was evident in every foot gained, every record kept, and every worker who climbed higher. By the time the crew reached lift 28, the tower stood as both an engineering achievement and a test of how far a community and a construction team could push the limits of speed and scale. The next decisions made under the shadow of schedule and expectation would carry consequences no one could take back. Dennis and Dale McCarty learned the trade from their father, a pipe fitter who worked the same riverbanks before them. By 1978, both brothers carried United Association union cards, with the Pleasance Power Station stamped as their primary site. Dennis, the older by 3 years, had already logged hours on cooling towers in Marietta and Wheeling. Dale, quieter and always ready with a joke, joined him at Willow Island, drawn by steady work and the hope of a better wage. Each morning they left their rented house outside St. Mary's before dawn, lunch pails packed by Dennis's wife, Linda. On the scaffold, the brothers worked shoulder to shoulder, tying rebar and bolting strongbacks, trusting each other with their lives. Union membership was more than a job. It was a bond, a promise to share both risk and reward. Mary Holliday's path was different. At 28, she was one of the few women on the crew, a general laborer who had just earned her welding certificate. Her 2 children, ages 3 and 5, stayed with her aunt while Mary worked the tower. She wore her union badge clipped to her jacket, proud of the skills she'd earned and the respect she'd won. In letters home, she wrote of exhaustion and pride, of watching the tower rise and hoping her wages would open new doors for her children. Her family kept those letters along with a photograph of Mary in her hard hat, smiling in the shadow of the unfinished shell. Earl Peterson, the senior foreman, was a familiar face on big jobs throughout the valley. Once a school teacher, he brought a methodical eye to every task, insisting on daily safety briefings and careful records. His wife, Margaret, remembered him as a man who never left home without his notebook and a pocket full of pencils. Their son, Michael, had joined the crew as an apprentice, learning the ropes under his father's watchful eye. Earl's reputation for fairness and discipline earned him respect from both laborers and management, but he felt the weight of responsibility for every man on the platform. The McCarty, Holliday, and Peterson families formed the backbone of Willow Island's workforce. Their lives were woven together through union halls, church pews, and Little League games. Pay stubs and union cards shared space in kitchen drawers with family photos and handwritten notes. For many, the job at the power station was more than a paycheck. It was a source of pride, a way to keep children in school and homes warm through winter. Workers relied on each other far beyond the job, sharing rides, tools, and meals, watching over one another as the scaffold climbed higher. When disaster struck, loss was measured in names and faces. The McCarty family lost both sons. Mary Holliday's children lost their mother. The Petersons lost a father and mentor. Grief swept through Willow Island and every town that sent workers to the plant. The memory of those 51 lives, preserved in union records, family albums, and annual memorials, remains a reminder that Willow Island's story is, above all, a story of people, their labor, their hopes, and the price they paid. At first light on April 27, 1978, the Willow Island site was quiet but tense. The air held a chill, just 30 degrees Fahrenheit at the 6:30 a.m. weather check, with humidity near 80%. Dew clung to the steel frames and wooden planks of the jump form scaffold, a sign of the cold night that had slowed everything, including the concrete's hardening deep in the tower walls. Workers gathered by the base, coffee in hand, eyes on the unfinished rim above. Each man knew the day's plan: raise the scaffold, pour the next ring, keep the project on schedule. But the weather had its own agenda, and the concrete poured the previous morning had only 20 hours to cure, less than the standard called for in the manuals and less than what the engineers had recommended during training. Pressure to move forward was constant, delays cost money, and the schedule was tight. Management tracked every hour, and bonuses depended on progress. The foreman on duty that morning, a man known for his steady hand and measured tone, walked the platform before sunrise. He checked the anchor bolts, looked for cracks, and ran his palm over the cold surface of Lift 28's concrete. The forms had been set the day before, with rebar tied and the last bucket of mix poured just before dusk. Overnight, the mercury dropped, slowing the chemical reaction that turned wet concrete into the backbone of the rising shell. At 8:10 a.m., the site foreman signed the jump form release. His authorization meant the crew could proceed, raise the scaffold, load it with men and equipment, and begin preparations for the next lift. The signature, recorded in the daily log, was a green light that carried both hope and risk. The decision balanced the reality of early morning temperatures with the demands of the construction schedule. The foreman's authority was clear, but so was the weight of responsibility. He relied on visual checks and experience, trusting the process that had brought the tower this far. No one paused to question whether the concrete had truly reached the strength needed to support the scaffold, the workers, and the tons of material soon to be hoisted above the valley. By mid-morning, work on Lift 28 was in full swing. The platform hung 166 feet above the ground, braced by anchor bolts sunk into concrete that had barely had a night to set. Crews moved with purpose, passing tools and calling out measurements over the hum of pumps and the distant sound of trucks arriving with fresh mix. The ticking clock of the day's schedule drove every action, but the cold, damp air lingered, a silent warning that curing concrete does not follow human deadlines. Every decision made on that scaffold, from the foreman's sign-off to the crew's first step onto the platform, carried consequences that would only become clear in the hours ahead. The green light given that morning set in motion a chain of events that could not be reversed. The scaffold, the shell, and the men who built them now depended on concrete that was still waking from the night's freeze. As the clock approached 10 a.m., the structure stood tall, but beneath the surface, the limits of time, temperature, and trust were being tested. The collapse at Willow Island was not the result of a single oversight, but of a cascade of technical failures that began deep within the concrete itself. On the morning of April 27, 1978, the jump form scaffold and its entire load pressed down on Lift 28, a ring of concrete that had cured for just 20 hours. Field tests taken that day revealed a compression strength of only 220 pounds per square inch. This figure stands in stark contrast to the minimum 400 pounds per square inch required before any construction load should have been applied. The concrete, still cold from the night's low temperatures, had barely developed 5% of its intended strength. The jump form system depended on the integrity of each lift. Steel anchor bolts, threaded through galvanized sleeves and tightened against heavy plates, were designed to transfer the weight of the formwork, the fresh concrete, and the workers into the previously cured shell. But at Willow Island, several anchors were missing altogether, and others had been installed with shorter sleeves than the engineering drawing specified. These shortcuts reduced both the embedment and the pull-out strength of the bolts. With the scaffold, equipment, and 51 men on the platform, the load on each anchor surged past the safe limit. Design calculations called for a safety factor of at least 2, meaning the structure should have been able to support twice the expected load. In reality, the margin had fallen to just a tenth of what was needed. The concrete's actual strength, measured at 220 pounds per square inch, provided a safety factor of only 0.1. Under these conditions, even a minor shift in weight or a sudden gust of wind could trigger a catastrophic failure. Investigators from the National Bureau of Standards and OSHA later traced the sequence of events through lab tests and engineering models. They found that the weakened concrete could not resist the shearing force at the base of the scaffold. As the crew hoisted the third bucket of wet concrete for the next lift, the pressure concentrated around cathead crane 4. The anchor bolts at this point began to tear through the soft concrete, setting off a chain reaction. One connection failed, then another. The load redistributed to the remaining anchors, each already overstressed. Within seconds, the system lost all ability to hold together. The technical story is one of numbers and calculations, but the consequences were immediate and devastating. The decisions to shorten curing times, to modify anchorage details, and to move ahead without verified strength combined to erase any margin for error. The collapse did not come as a gradual warning, but as a sudden and total failure, a structural breakdown that left no time for escape or correction. The lessons drawn from Willow Island are now written into every safety manual and building code. Concrete must reach its specified strength before it carries any load, and every anchor, every bolt, every inspection must be verified. The memory of 51 lost lives is etched not only in stone, but in the rules that govern construction sites across the country. Their sacrifice endures in the standards that protect workers today. At 10 o'clock on the morning of April 27, 1978, the Willow Island site was alive with the routine of heavy construction. Crews moved across the jump-form platform, 166 feet above the ground, focused on the next lift. Then, with no warning, the rhythm shattered. Cathead Crane 4, responsible for hoisting the third bucket of wet concrete, suddenly lurched. The cable went slack. The crane swung inward, and the scaffold began to tilt. Steel anchor bolts, already strained by the weight of men and machinery, tore through concrete that had not yet hardened. In a breath, the structure lost its grip. A sound like thunder rolled across the valley. Workers on the ground looked up and saw the entire scaffold, platform, formwork, equipment, and 51 men peeling away from the tower's rim. The collapse happened in less than 10 seconds. The scaffold folded in on itself, dragging the fresh ring of concrete and every man on the platform into a free fall. From the base, one eyewitness later recalled, "I looked and it was gone. The scaffolding was just gone." The falling mass struck the ground with a force that sent dust and debris billowing across the site. The silence that followed was immediate and absolute. For those who witnessed the disaster, the image of the scaffold's sudden disappearance remains fixed in memory, a moment when a day's work became unimaginable loss. 51 workers died in that collapse. Fathers, sons, brothers, neighbors. Many had started their shift only hours earlier, sharing coffee and plans for the weekend. Now, in a span shorter than a single breath, the entire crew was gone. The scale of the tragedy was hard to process. The ground beneath the ruined tower filled with splintered wood, twisted steel, and the remains of lives interrupted. Families waiting at home would learn within hours that their loved ones would not return. The aftermath was marked by shock and disbelief. Emergency sirens broke the quiet as first responders rushed to the scene. The community, so closely tied to the plant, gathered at the site's edge, searching for answers. The collapse at Willow Island was not just a technical failure, it was a human disaster, witnessed in real time by friends and co-workers who would never forget what they saw that morning. In the days that followed, investigators would piece together the chain of events, tracing every bolt and decision that led to the collapse. But in those first moments, the only certainty was loss. The disaster at Willow Island stands as the deadliest construction accident in American history, a catastrophe measured not only in steel and concrete, but in the lives of 51 men who fell together, and in the silence that settled over a community forever changed. At 10:05 a.m., the first sirens reached Willow Island. The Ritchie County Volunteer Fire Department arrived within minutes, their trucks winding up the access road as crews scrambled to secure the site. The scale of the destruction was immediately clear. The cooling tower's shell had been torn open, the scaffold and work platforms reduced to twisted steel and splintered wood. Firefighters, paramedics, and plant security fanned out across the debris, searching for any sign of life among the wreckage. Mercy Hospital's medevac helicopter circled overhead, ready to airlift survivors. But as the first responders moved from one crushed platform to the next, hope faded quickly. The collapse had been total. In the first hour, rescue teams found only silence beneath the tangled remains. By noon, the scene had shifted from rescue to recovery. The incident command took shape on the perimeter, with state emergency officials and company representatives coordinating efforts to identify victims and clear the site for investigators. The work was grim and methodical. Many firefighters recognized the names on the shift list: neighbors, friends, relatives. Each body recovered was a blow to the community that built the tower together. The river, usually a route for barges and fishing boats, became a path for ferrying heavy equipment and debris away from the disaster area. As word spread, families gathered at the plant gates, waiting for news that would not bring relief. The rescue effort at Willow Island was swift, but the outcome was already written in the ruins of the tower. In those first 2 hours, the reality set in. There would be no survivors. The loss rippled outward, touching every household in the valley. The work of the first responders, though carried out with speed and resolve, became the first act of mourning for a community changed forever. The pain of Willow Island did not end with the last siren. In the days after the collapse, grief swept through every church, school, and union hall in Pleasants County. 51 families faced empty chairs at dinner tables. The echoes of that mourning reached far beyond the plant gates, touching neighbors, classmates, and friends who had shared the rhythms of life along the Ohio River. The loss was not just personal, it was communal. In the months that followed, the local economy staggered. With so many breadwinners gone, household incomes in the area dropped by 12%. Stores saw fewer customers, and some families moved away, unable to recover from the blow. The power station, once a symbol of hope, became a daily reminder of what had been lost. To honor those who died, the community gathered at the plant's entrance and set a granite plaque into the ground. The names, ages, and union affiliations of all 51 victims are etched into the stone. Each April 27th, residents return for a memorial service. The ceremony is simple: a reading of the names, a moment of silence, music, and the laying of flowers. These rituals are not only for the families, but for everyone who remembers the day the scaffold fell. Over time, the memorial has become a place where stories are shared, and the lessons of Willow Island are passed to new generations. The disaster's shadow lingers in the collective memory, shaping how the community speaks about work, risk, and safety. The annual gathering is both a tribute to those lost and a reminder of the price paid when caution is set aside. Federal investigators arrived at Willow Island within hours of the collapse. OSHA's team began collecting evidence, interviewing witnesses, and reviewing every detail of the construction process. Their final report cited willful and serious violations of federal safety codes, specifically 29 CFR 1926.550 for cranes and derricks and 29 CFR 1926.701 for concrete construction. The findings were direct. Uncured concrete had been loaded well before it reached the required strength. Anchor bolts were missing or incorrectly installed, and there was no documented verification of field strength before the scaffold was raised. These lapses pointed to a breakdown in both engineering oversight and day-to-day safety checks. 3 firms faced accountability: Research Cottrell Inc., Pittsburgh Des Moines Steel Company, and General Electric Co. OSHA proposed fines totaling $108,300, the maximum allowed by law at the time. After negotiations, the companies settled for $85,500, about $1,700 for each life lost. No criminal charges were filed. The settlement did not include any admission of wrongdoing, but it did require the firms to review and improve their safety practices on future projects. The legal consequences for the companies involved fell short of what many in the community expected. Still, the citations and fines established a clear link between regulatory violations and tragic outcomes. The Willow Island case became a reference point in OSHA's enforcement history, shaping the standards that would govern scaffolding, concrete curing, and job site inspections for decades to come. The aftermath made it clear that shortcuts, whether in paperwork or procedure, could carry the highest possible cost. Across the construction industry, the lessons of Willow Island became impossible to ignore. In the decade after the collapse, federal regulators rewrote the rules that govern how concrete is poured, how scaffolding is anchored, and how every critical step is verified before lives are put at risk. The most direct legacy is written into OSHA's Concrete and Masonry Construction Standard, known as Subpart Q, issued in 1988. This regulation requires that no load, whether it's a scaffold, equipment, or even a worker, can be placed on a concrete structure until field tests confirm it has reached the strength specified by the engineer. The days of relying on visual checks or guesswork ended with this rule. Every major project now demands documented proof, cylinder breaks, maturity curves, and increasingly, real-time digital monitoring. The scaffolding standards codified in Subpart L during the 1990s set out new requirements for anchor bolt verification and engineered calculations for jump form systems. These rules call for third-party inspection and certification before a scaffold can be advanced. The industry also adopted the ASTM C1074 maturity method, which uses temperature sensors and time tracking to provide an objective measure of concrete strength on site. This method, first adopted in 1987, has since become a global benchmark for safe construction sequencing. Industry experts point to Willow Island as the catalyst for this transformation. The disaster is cited in training manuals, engineering textbooks, and safety courses as the reason why strength verification is now non-negotiable. The field strength mandate, the independent scaffold inspection, and the requirement for documented science-based checks all trace their roots to the aftermath of that April morning. The legacy of those 51 men lives on in every job site where safety comes first, where regulations are treated not as paperwork, but as a matter of life and death. Every modern hard hat, safety inspection, and scaffold regulation stands in silent testament to the lives lost here. The lessons written in concrete and grief at Willow Island shape every major construction site today. For the families and communities left behind, the cost remains deeply personal. As long as towers rise, their story warns against haste and neglect. Safety isn't just policy, it's a promise paid for by 51 workers who must never be forgotten.